Hey, this is Kaylin Huntress, and I am eating out in New Zealand, and I'm not tipping, because tipping doesn't happen here. The service in New Zealand is not a whole lot different, except for two little things that I've noticed that are different. The first is that sometimes you pay for your meal right up front, and actually at the front, you make your order, you pay for your meal, and then you sit down and they bring it to you. And that's different than the United States. And the other difference is that if you don't like your meal, you can't send it back. You can't say, oh, well, I don't like this meal, I'm not going to pay for it, because you've already paid for it. And that's different in the States, where it's expected you're going to pay 10 to 20% more than the cost of the meal. And that's tipping in the United States. And as I understand it, that's unique to the United States, that you tip. Tipping originally came from this box in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in New York. They put this little box out that said, to improve performance. And it was to improve the performance of their staff. It was an extra gratuity that was spread out amongst the staff, and they pooled their tips. Don't get me started on pooling tips. I have a whole thing about that. But I used to work for tips, and I was a waiter for a long time, and that's how I made my living. I put myself through school by being a waiter. And when I was living in Santa Fe, and I was a fine dining waiter in an Italian restaurant, I made $2.13 an hour. That was what the restaurant paid me, because they were legally allowed to pay me half of what minimum wage was, because they knew that I was getting tips. And so tipping has kind of become this beast in the United States, where the businesses that are being run, they know that waiters are being tipped, so they don't even have to pay the legal minimum wage, because they know that the servers are getting more extra money through this tipping. And now it's become essential that you have to survive on tips. All of my wages that the restaurants paid me went to taxes, and I never saw anything from my paychecks. I only lived on tips. When I was in college, I made $150 to $200 a night serving fine Italian wines and being able to speak knowledgeably about the differences between different wine regions, and that was how I made my living. But I never could have lived on $2 an hour. New Zealand is different. They actually pay a living wage. And so people here are able to actually survive off of what the restaurant pays them, and it factors into the price. But when I do the math, the cost of going out to eat here in New Zealand is just about the same as what it costs to go out to eat in Portland after I factor in the tips. So in Portland, I tip 15 to 20% all the time, because I know that the people who are working in the restaurant that I'm eating at, they survive on the amount that I tip. What's different is that it's voluntary. You don't have to pay that extra tip. And that's what I find so strange and bizarre about the United States, is that it's voluntary in some situations to pay the taxes that actually keep the society running around you. If you want to opt out and not pay that extra amount, there are mechanisms in place so you don't have to pay the actual cost. And so some jerks can get services in the United States at a lesser price if they make it worse for other people who are trying to live their lives. And that's just bizarre. So I really like it in New Zealand, where people make a living wage, and the food is still good, and the service is still good, and it's all factored in, and it's all fair. That's what it feels like here in New Zealand. It's all fair. And that's different when you have to tip, and it's voluntary. It means that if the performance of a server is subpar, that I can decide as the consumer that I'm gonna pay less because that server had too many people in their section, or because, you know, the business was not doing well and nobody came in and ate, and so they make no money. And that shouldn't be a risk that an employee shoulders. You know, if nobody comes into the restaurant because the restaurant isn't doing well, then the server not making enough money to live on that day, that just doesn't seem fair. And so one of the things I like about New Zealand is that things are made to be fair here. And so, yeah, it might be a little bit more in the price, but it's as much as you would pay if you were actually paying the price of what it costs to have everybody in the restaurant working there. So, but more than that, the psychological difference of not having to mentally add on the extra amount of how much it should really be, because I'm a good person, it's really useful because I could just say, oh, this meal costs X number of dollars and that's what I'm gonna pay. It's a lot clearer. So I like the clarity and I like the fairness and I like not having to think about it. And if it was my way, I'd say let's not do the tipping system anymore. But you can't really make that happen by showing up at an American restaurant and not tipping because the servers aren't making enough money to live on. So it's a challenging problem. I think we would probably just have to outlaw tipping at some point in the future and say after January 1st of 2018, there's no more tipping and servers have to make a living wage. They make $18 an hour here for working in a cafe as an entry level. And that's about how much you would make with tips in an entry level position. So I like the way they do it here and I'm gonna go out to eat a few more times.